No. Okay. Right. So we're on preparing for the quarterly sales meeting. We'll be talking about the standard, as you can expect, date, time, location, preparing a draft agenda. I think that's really key. It's one of the key things I'm going to talk about today. That's right. It's right at the beginning. The things that you need to confirm with the sales manager, the sales lead, whoever is leading the team, because again, that the titles can be different in an SME, right? You want to be confirming if you need a pre-meeting survey, whether there'll be pre-work. The pre-work part is actually really pivotal because sometimes the head of sales isn't necessarily thinking about that in that level of detail until right up until it's like a few days before. And then they want to say, oh yeah, no, I want them to look at this beforehand. And it's like, actually, we're not giving them enough time to sort that out. And you're going to have people working in their evenings. And your head of sales might not mind that, but ideally we want to give people the time to do pre-work during their actual working day. Facilitation management, the very simple, will you be introducing the host? Because we're not the hosts, we're the facilitators. Or will they be just handling it all? And whether it will just be salespeople alone or whether there will be additional speakers who will be speaking specifically. So if you figured out what the topics are, then who is actually speaking? Again, if that's not really pinpointed, then what can happen? I've seen it. You can start doing things, and then it's just like, oh, well, I thought you were going to talk about that. I thought you were going to talk about that. They hadn't actually discussed amongst themselves. It might seem like tiny things, but it's worth going through. So time zone. This is one where I fell down today because there's a period of time in March for 2 to 3 weeks or so where the US puts their clocks forward before the UK does. And I didn't realize we were within that time. So there are some people who've already messaged saying they can't attend, but they're going to watch the recording. But checking out the time zones is obviously really, really important. Even when you do it all the time, it's always worth checking because I've fallen into that trap today. Where it's online as well, if you're doing it in person, it's when you've had quarterly meetings, it's usually like the whole day, right? Doing a half day is kind of disruptive. So you do a whole day thing, you hire out a room or whatever. But that's actually really, really exhausting if you do one whole day online. I don't know what the specific human mechanics is around it, but for some reason, being online and having to listen like that is just a lot more draining. So if you do have a one-day event, I'd highly advise splitting it up over 2 half days. And if you do have people that are international, for example, Europe and the US, then obviously that would be the afternoons. So that's how a lot of them that I've had to deal with, I've run, is just do 2 afternoons back to back. Sometimes if you have to, you do one afternoon on this Tuesday and then one the following week. As long as people know that that's what's happening in advance so that they can plan themselves around it, you don't really tend to get too much pushback on the fact that it's not all one day and can't we just get it over and done with, right? Public holidays, business events, vacations. There is a website that I use. It is called officeholidays.com. No affiliation. You can find other ones online, but that shows a lot of the public holidays worldwide. And it's worth looking at that because if you just try to rely on your Outlook calendar, if it's synced with everything, it isn't necessarily. The amount of times just like, oh, Germany has a random public holiday on a Thursday for whatever reason. Whereas I'm from the UK, as like our public holidays are on Mondays and Fridays. There aren't any that's in the middle of the week unless it's Christmas. So you won't necessarily know. Checking for business events, if there's any marketing events going on, you want to avoid those, obviously, but also avoid the time either side of them because people will be preparing to be away for a little while. And then when they've come back, if they haven't been adding their leads to whatever the CRM system is, then they're going to have to spend their time doing that and organizing their thoughts. You don't want to distract them with this meeting. And then vacations. So whether people put their vacations in one HR system that everybody can access, like the company that I'm working with uses HiBob, or people put their vacations in their Outlook, again, it's worth looking. Now, for vacations, you're never going to get it right with everyone, but the main people that you know need to be there, it's worth going and checking those people individually. Otherwise, you will have to change the date again and again and again. The location, obviously, if it's online, it's going to be a platform. It is worth using a platform that your company naturally uses organically rather than finding an additional fancy piece of software, unless that's what's specifically been asked for. But these days, Zoom and MS Teams now both have breakout rooms, which is usually the main thing that's asked for. So MS Teams can be a little bit clunky, but if that's what you're using your day to day and you're already comfortable with it as the person who's facilitating it, so managing the back end, it is just, you're better off just sticking with what you know rather than trying something new live with everybody on the call who's already sitting on the call like, whatever, because it can get really, you can get quite flustered. There's a lot to manage behind the scenes. And the amount of messages that you get as somebody who's facilitating a meeting, we'll talk about that in a second, but it's just, most of the meetings that I've ever been on, I've had to watch the recordings and just listen to it in the background while I was working because I can't remember anything that's being said because of the sheer amount of conversations I'm having in the background. Facilitating is a job in itself, right? Checking who is going to be there specifically. Is it just going to be the sales team, or is it going to be the sales team and representatives from certain sister departments that we want to hear from or that have actively asked to be here? Will everyone be online? That's worth checking, because if some people are in person and some people aren't, then they might want your assistant setting up their own tech. Ideally not, they could set it up themselves, but it's just worth checking. Because also, if you have a sales team that's big enough and one sales manager has decided that they want to take their team somewhere and the others haven't, you might have to be prepared for a little bit of disgruntled chatter if that conversation hasn't happened between sales managers either, because it might not be your fault, but again, you're facilitating an event. It's worth checking that out. And do you have feedback from the previous meeting? Did people say, oh, this was good, I didn't like that, I really wanted to hear about that? It's worth keeping all of that in mind as well when you're preparing. I can't see any questions just yet, so I'm moving on. As I said, if you do have questions or